Bring a Trailer podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bring a Trailer podcast. Alex Porter here, coming to you from Bring a Trailer headquarters in San Francisco. And I am very excited to say that today I am joined by Tommy Kendall, racing driver, racing icon, IMSA and Trans Am champion, NASCAR driver, TV commentator, man of many tastes. We were talking architecture before we started recording. Tommy, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. It's an honor as one of the many Bring a Trailer addicts. I go a good ways back with the site, and even before that, when it wasn't an actual auction site. So, honored to be part of it.
Oh man, I actually hadn't intended to start with this, but since you took us there, I was looking at your account, spying on you a little bit. Your account goes back at least 8 years, but you were on it before, in the pre-auction days. Is that right?
Yeah, a good friend of mine, Martin Lauber, in the Bay Area.
Oh yeah, we know Martin. Yep.
Yeah, he's actually a fraternity brother of my little brothers. He came to watch me race at Sears Point when I drove the Mellow Yellow car in 1991. They had driven someone's dad's Rolls Royce up from UCLA to go to the NASCAR race. Anyways, Martin turned me on to Bring a Trailer. He used to send me little links about what it was, which was looking for ads for cars for sale. And so I've been familiar from the get-go and have watched it and have been hooked, have had to unsubscribe to the email because it keeps me from getting things done and so forth.
Oh man, well, we appreciate that. Martin's got some cool race cars these days. Do you ever drive any of his cars? Have you vintage raced at all?
You know what? It's funny. I don't know. The only thing he's ever invited me to drive was his Lemons car. So I don't know what that says.
He's keeping you out of the good stuff, huh? That's great. That's fantastic. Well, I actually would love to dive into some of the interesting cars that you've bid on and won. You've also got a comment with a huge number of thumbs up on it that I'd like to talk about. But before we do that, let's dive into your early history, if you don't mind. I know that you come from a car family and you're a SoCal kid. How does it all start? You're the son of another racer, isn't that correct?
Yes, my dad, RIP, passed away earlier this year after a very, very good run. But he was a car guy with no money, when he was younger, and so when things started going better business-wise for him, he always had some cars, even when he didn't have money. And we had a speedboat that he built with help from some friends. But when you're a kid, you don't really even know what money is. But I just noticed when the cars changed. And, for the longest time, he drove an LTD and my mom drove a country Squire wagon, which I follow everyone that comes on Bring a Trailer. And I'm not alone. They go for pretty good money.
Oh, we've had some good country Squires recently. Did you see the one with the Paxton Supercharger on it? It was a 56 or a 57, I think.
I did not see that one.
Oh, man. I'm going to send you that link.
That had the 4-speed was the holy
Oh,
grail.
yes. Yeah.
So that was the thing. And then, he built a building. He was in the real estate business. He built a building, I think it was Datsun's first warehouse in America. And so he got a 240Z when they came out. And that was the first new car and the first thing, the least bit exciting. And it kind of went from there. So he got the bug. I guess I was only 6 when that happened. But, memories of scouring the LA Times classifieds on Sunday and going to look at some cars and so forth, buying a few of them. And then just eventually going, and he got the bug hard. And fortunately for him, he really hit it business-wise. And so he was on a buying frenzy for a while. Before, there was a lot of, you didn't know what everyone was doing in the world like you do now. And so our neighbor was a guy named Pete Smith, whose family was in the car biz, and he ran Bob Smith Porsche Audi in North Hollywood.
Oh, yeah.
And sold cars to Newman, Redford, McQueen. And basically, he had a son my age. So at the Little League games, he was always showing up literally a different car every game. And he started blowing in my dad's ear about stuff. And my dad was pretty frugal and he wouldn't buy anything new. And so he talked to him. And his first Porsche was a 74 Carrera. One of his customers was upgrading to a turbo in 76. And my dad bought his Carrera and it went from there. And so just so many great memories of all of that. Looking for cars, getting the nod from my dad since I'm one of 4 boys. We did a lot of stuff with my dad, but every once in a while you get the solo call. And I remember one of the great ones was, hey, let's go shooting up Angeles Crest, because we lived at the bottom of Angeles Crest Highway. And we're going to take the Porsche, put a couple guns in the trunk, the front trunk, drive up the crest and do some target shooting. And So it was, so I could still click into 6, 7, 8-year-old TK before I had my career in racing and so forth. And I still kind of feel like the same kid, but obviously, had a great run in the biz as well.
What an amazing time to be in SoCal, like a great car culture time to be in Southern California. Were you guys going to races up at Willow, or were you going to motorsport events or even just car events around the Los Angeles area?
At first it's funny, because to try to remind people what it was like without internet and cable TV, you had magazines and 3 TV channels. And so I didn't really know anything about car racing. I got into dirt bikes. We used to go water skiing. So it was boats and dirt bikes at first. We'd go to Indian Dunes. And then when my dad started getting into the car stuff via Pete, eventually it turned to racing. And I went to my first car race. So we didn't do a lot of race stuff. I remember once vaguely going to Ontario and seeing a bike race way back. I was really young, so barely remember it. And so the first entree was 1980. Pete convinced my dad to buy a race car. And my dad's like, what am I going to do with a race car? And now I know how it works. Everyone's always trying to hustle and get into the seats. And he's like, well, you can go to Bondurant and I'll drive it in the meantime.
Yeah, everyone always wants you to buy it, but then they're going to drive it. It's always somebody else's race car is always the best one to have.
Well, thank God it happened, because if that conversation doesn't happen, Pete doesn't convince my dad doesn't go to Bonner, buy the car. Anyways, we go to Sears Point, 1980, summer of 80, and I go to my first IMSA race, and my entire world and life changed that day, because that's all I could think about from that point on. And you still, you had to kind of work to find information, whether it was magazines or books and stuff like that. And my dad saw the look in my eyes and said, this is not something you can do for a living. This is for fun. And so, your deal is if you get good grades, we'll get a go-kart, keep getting good grades. You can go to racing school. And it went from there. So that was actually probably the only thing that could have gotten me to focus on school. And it did. And so I was able to fulfill the sponsorship requirement, and we got going. And then even with that, to thread the needle and actually turn it into a career is against the odds. But as you said, the super rich time of it was loosely organized again, because you didn't have this network effect of everyone knowing what everyone's doing, and so it was a much slower pace. So it was you'd go to the drags maybe, but it was a little bit Bob's Big Boy, you'd see some cars. Sure. It was just sort of organic, really, what was going on.
Did you go to Pomona? Did you ever go to Pomona in the 80s?
I did not go until I was racing. I did not go to Pomona until I was racing. And I remember my first time seeing a nitro car. It's
nothing like it. Yeah, totally. I'm trying to get more of my young colleagues to go see that, because it's earth shattering when you see 2 top fuel cars or 2 nitro cars leave the line and you're close to them.
Yeah, you can have zero interest in racing or cars, really, and you need to see a nitro car run once.
100%. So was your dad sponsoring you in karts, or he was racing himself too, or both?
Both. He was he got started late, but he got the bug pretty hard. And so, he bought this, an RSR, and he got his license pretty quickly. And
was that his first race car? That's a pretty serious way to start out.
Yeah. Well, again, he didn't know any better. And so and Pete said, and Pete didn't steer him too wrong on everything that he told him to buy was a choice car that you wanted. I wish he still had all of them, or one of them.
Do you know what happened to that car? Have you followed that RSR?
That car, I think a guy named Jeff Lewis owns it, because it was a factory RSR, and it won the IMSA GTO title in '79, I think, with Howard Meister. So it was painted in those Andile colors.
Yeah,
and so it was a pedigreed car, and so my dad sold it to a guy who had it for quite a few years, and Jeff Lewis bought it and put it back into Howard Meister championship livery. And so that car, I saw it at Rennsport, the Rennsport before this one.
Amazing. Was he mainly a Porsche racer? Did he race other things too? Any Datsuns? Any Datsun race cars?
Well, not that he drove. He was mostly Porsches. Okay. He had crazy stuff. He had the RSR, then he bought an M1 Pro car, and then and true to form, he always kind of bought stuff when everyone was going to the newer stuff. So
Uh-huh.
it was on sale. I want to say he paid 50 grand for the RSR.
Perfect time to buy these things, right? Like when everyone wants the new thing, and no wonder you wish he still had them.
As a young guy, I used to make, I was always into the whatever was the latest and reading
Yeah.
On Track and Auto Week and said, Dad, what about this? And he's like, yeah. And I think he realized for the amount extra it would cost, and he was really pretty inexperienced. He says, the difference for me isn't that big a deal. And so he always kind of bought, similar to how he bought that first Carrera, he'd buy. And so he bought a 935 when everybody was going to the prototypes. And so everything was sort of super on sale. And then he kept all that stuff for a good while. And he didn't make like if he had kept it a day, but he said later, he says, I basically made back all the money I spent racing by holding on to those cars that I bought at the bottom. And because he had good advice on what to buy, he bought great stuff. He just kind of had this sense about, he didn't move too quickly on stuff. And that came probably from real estate. It came probably from growing up with no money. He had to really, make things make sense. And so, yeah, I mean, we could talk about him for the whole episode.
Totally. Well, those are probably great lessons for you as a young man, right? To watch somebody working that way.
It was, and one of the cool things about my dad is, winding back a little bit, he played football at UCLA in an unlikely situation, walked on, fifth string tailback, ended up starting, didn't get drafted, walked on for the Houston Oilers, made the team, just incredible discipline and hard work and effort. And so then got into real estate and had some really hard times early on, but just kept at it and kind of basically hit it out of the park eventually. And so, but as a competitive athlete, I realized when he passed, it hadn't ever really hit me. He never, ever pushed us. He taught us how to compete by the way he lived, but he never got upset at a little league game. He always tried to talk us out of things. He's like, are you doing this because of me? He literally never pushed us to do anything, but he set an example of how to compete. And he was just super focused, super disciplined. And it's a rare combination because he basically got to achieve his dreams in sports, and he wasn't trying to live through us at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't fully grasp how special and rare that was until he passed completely. Most of it I had, but not the final little piece.
Man, what a father. What a way to grow up. I mean, it shapes you as a person. And then he's also, like you said, supporting you in your early racing at the same time. Is that right? Karting to start with?
Yeah, it was karting first. And then, so I got a late start by karting standards. Right. I didn't get a kart until I was 15. But then because he was into the cars, I actually got into cars early. Back then, you couldn't even get an SCCA license until you're 18. I found a loophole that the Jim Russell School Series, if you'd been through their school, you could race in their school series. So I was already into a car by the time I was 17. And
was Jim Russell open wheel cars back in the 80s too?
Yes, that was right when they switched from Formula Fords to the Mazda powered cars.
Gotcha. Oh, okay, cool. All right.
Yeah. And so I did the Mazda and the Mazda Pro Series. That was some of the first stuff I did before I turned 18. You mentioned the Datsuns and Nissans. Max Jones was a guy who went on to have a hell of a career. But when my dad bought an older RX-7 for my older brother and I to do, he said, we'll do 4 races this year and you guys can split them. And so at Sebring, we needed a third driver. The guy driving with my dad, Jim Cook, says, hey, there's this young guy out of Long Beach, real hustler, sharp kid, older than me. He was 35, but he drove at Sebring with us and he had no money, but he said, I'll let you drive my Showroom Stock car to my dad in 3 races. And there was, back then it was the Playboy Endurance Series and the Firehawk Series were just getting started. And my dad drove this, basically a SSA 300ZX, no power, no brakes. And he says, I have no interest in that. He drove it one time and he says to me, you drive it. So I got to do those 3 races with Max and it was a great partnership. I ended up being Max's regular teammate. We won 3 24-hour races. We won the Firehawk Championship in a 300ZX Turbo in '86. I have that car now. So that's my Nissan experience. A little bit oddball, but it was some great times. Showroom Stock back when the cars weren't GT4 cars like they are now. And, making diffs last, making brakes last. It really was an art form to get those things to go fast without wearing them out.
And a hell of an education too. I imagine those lessons stuck with you for your whole career, right?
Yeah, because all the guys I started open wheel racing with in the Russell series, a number of them, it was a great class, and that's probably
Yeah, I was going to
why.
ask, who'd you come up with? Anybody, any names we would know in terms of folks that you were coming up with?
Yeah, well, Johnny O'Connell, who, obviously the winningest American ever, most tenured American ever at Le Mans, winningest at Sebring. So Johnny was in that class. A guy named Jeff Krosnoff, who got all the way to Indy cars, tragically was killed at Toronto. Danny Thompson, Mickey's son. Ken Twaits, who's a guy who's come back into Trans Am recently. Mike Groff, who made it to Indy cars. Scott Atchison, who made it to Indy cars. David Kudrave, who made it to Indy cars, and a bunch of guys that were as quick as them in those cars that didn't go anywhere. And so
Yeah,
it's just
because luck is matters so much, right? Or fate, or kind of twists of chance.
luck, fate, and funding, to be
Yeah.
honest.
Oh, totally.
Even
Of
with
course.
funding, you need the other things too, unless
Yeah.
you have incredible funding. So that's where my story kind of turned. Obviously, I had some backing, but to go Super V racing was $400,000 a year, which was about 4 times what I had to spend. And
Sure.
so my dad says, we're going to buy an older RX-7 and you're going to do a handful of races, West Coast races and so forth. I'm like,
Yeah.
right on. And so all my friends are like, why are you driving those Showroom Stock cars? That's stupid. I'm like, well, it's something. It's better than sitting home and claiming I'm an open wheel driver that doesn't drive. And, speaking of fate and fortune, this is right when the manufacturers really kind of started coming back into sports car racing. And so they weren't that much in the open wheels yet. And so the only reliable funding in racing is tire companies, oil companies, and manufacturers, OEMs. The rest come and go. And so both of those were pretty heavy. And so that's where my opportunities first with Nissan and Mazda and then Chevy. So I didn't set out to be a sports car driver or a Trans Am driver. I always wanted to be an IndyCar driver or a Formula One driver, but the opportunities were there, and the rest is history. I mean, I wouldn't change it for the world, but at the time, it wasn't what my first choice was.
Totally. But I mean, you're following the places where you can get seat time, right? I mean, that's what you're after.
Yeah. And to your point about you must have learned a lot, Showroom Stock racing, not only how to be mechanically sympathetic and, you literally had to almost have a torque wrench in your foot on how hard you could push.
Yeah.
If you pushed it hard, you could literally blow the brakes off it in 3 laps. So how do you go 6 hours without changing brake pads and without boiling the fluid and all this stuff? And the cars, they moved so much, you really got to understand smoothness and weight transfer, which you didn't necessarily in go-karts, open wheel, Atlantics, and all that stuff that were just so bolted down. You learn useful stuff both places, but by driving so many different cars, I really think it helped me understand what was going on dynamically with the cars more.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if you could, I'm going to just admit my ignorance to you, Tommy. I love IMSA cars and Trans Am cars, especially from the 80s and 90s from your era. They're so cool looking. All these terms get thrown around, and there's nobody better to ask than you to kind of school me on all the different classes and types of cars, because some of them are silhouette racers. I really want to talk Berettas with you at some point, but some of them are silhouette, but some of them, maybe particularly in the mid 80s, are still kind of based on unibody cars, right? Or are they all silhouette cars, tube frame with bodywork on the outside? Or do some of them actually are they actually related to street cars?
Well, they started, from the Trans Am days and the sports car days, and then it got so there was less and less and less. And for an era, mostly through the 80s in GTO and stuff, they were full tube frame and Trans Am, full silhouette cars. And then they eventually got so far away from anything that was sold, everybody's like, this is silly. And now they eventually went back the other way. And now it's full blown GT3 and GT4, which are still incredibly enhanced and modified, but they are unibody cars. So so I did both. The bulk of my career was spent in the silhouette, IMSA, GU, GTO. I obviously did GTP, but of silhouette, tube frame cars.
Right. And I know you had early success in RX-7s, and those are, man, we just had a really cool RX-7 on the site. I don't know if you saw it. That was a rally car that was never used. Man, that car was cool. That guy, Greg Blue, that seller.
I'm sitting on my hands because I'm in timeout right now with my wife.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I wanted it really bad too. It was also kind of almost too nice. It had never been raced. I'm like, oh man, I'd feel guilty even driving that car. But I raced very briefly, Tommy, when I was in my early 20s also in an RX-7 in a spec series that kind of came before spec Mazda called Pro 7. And they were heavily modified little original RX-7s, that first body. And I loved driving those cars. And so that rally car really appealed to me. But you drove showroom stock in an RX-7, is that correct? So that's a unibody kind of modified street car. But then you also drove the success you had in the IMSA car is a silhouette RX-7. Is that right?
No.
Okay.
I never drove a showroom stock RX-7. The showroom
Okay.
stock was the Nissan.
Nissan, sorry. Okay.
And then that GTU car was it was a unibody. It wasn't full tube frame. That Malibu Grand
Okay.
Prix car that I won the 2 titles in, and I still own, is
really? Oh, wow.
or didn't own then, own now. I've owned it since '88, and
Amazing.
so that car was the last of the kind of unibody cars. Yes, so I mean that car is the total time capsule. And it's actually the winningest chassis in IMSA history because
Really?
it had won 3 titles before I ever got in it. Jim Downing built it and won the GTU title in '82. Jack Baldwin drove Ferrari Young in Malibu Grand Prix and won the title in '84 and '85. And then when he signed with Chevy, I got into that car and won the title in '86 and '87.
Amazing.
And I signed with Chevy. My dad bought the car from Clayton Cunningham, who was running it, and then loaned it back to him so my brother could drive it. And then when I graduated from UCLA, instead of getting a brand new car like all my brothers got, I got a clapped out, very historical RX-7, which I'm very happy that I have.
I bet. Also, that's a hell of a run for a single chassis, isn't it? That's
I mean, 5 titles. It's 21 individual race wins. It's won Daytona. It's won Sebring. 21 wins. So it's the winningest chassis, both race wins and championships in IMSA history. You don't get that kind of longevity. I mean, a car's not competitive for that long.
Have you vintage raced at all, or is it just kind of sit around as a talisman?
One time, I finally got it. I took it to Monterey, the Rolex Historics, I guess they call it now, in 2018. Mazda helped me. My old crew chief, who was my crew chief my whole career, Dan Binks, stores the cars. And I finally said, hey, I think it's time to we took it to Amelia the year before. And he said, what's the idea here? And I said, I got to do this on the cheap. I said, we're going to test this we love patinated race cars. And so I said, clean it up, but don't fix anything. And he called me, he says, can I clean the cat hair out of the seat? Because my cat used to be her hideout spot in my dad's old shop, was maybe because it smelled like me with my sweat in it. So
totally.
So we kind of got it running and went partially through it. And then, so that kind of broke the inertia. And then the next year, with some help from Mazda, we took it to Monterey. And the car had not been seen by anyone. It had been locked up out of sight for almost 30 years. And the fact that it's such an iconic car too. And then, I mean, I forgot, to be honest, exactly what it was like to drive that car. It was no power, no torque, no pinion steering, no rack and pinion, a steering box with all the deflection in it and so forth. It was hard work, but it was awesome.
Is that one of the cars that there's a real wild rotary engine that's used in competition cars? I can't remember what it's called, but it's got. Gosh, we sold one of these cars, a similar one on the website, and I'm trying to remember what it was, but it's a real elaborate version of the rotary, isn't it?
It's not that. It's a 13B with a peripheral-port, so it's got
peripheral-port. That's what it is. That's what I was thinking of. Yeah, okay.
Unusual idle. But it was. They ran them carbureted and fuel injected. Dan found some fuel injection. One of the little tweaks that Clayton Cunningham, who ran Ira Young's team and then eventually owned the cars, Daytona in '86. One of the big issues with those cars was the change in air temp and mixture. If they'd get too lean, they'd burn the seals, the apex seals. And so that's what happened. We had a huge lead in '86, big lead, and the thing, cooked the apex seals. And we actually changed. Well, you can't change the engine because John Paul Jr. was going to do a 12-hour sprint with a 935. That engine changed down to like 30 minutes, and they were going to put a new engine in and do another 12-hour sprint. And they said, nope. You got to use the block from the engine, or in a rotary, you got to use the casing. So my guys, it took us under 2 hours. They took the engine out, took it apart, rebuilt it, put it back in.
Oh my gosh.
And we had such a big lead, and it was a different era with attrition. We finished second that year.
Wow. What a story.
The next year, Clayton said, we got to come up with it. And so I had a second like brake bias knob, which was, I could adjust the mixture according to the exhaust temperatures. And then we had a thing that was technically illegal. It was a movable flap up in the radiator so that under yellow flags, you could effectively like put tape on the front end so that it didn't get too cold during cautions. And
Amazing.
yeah, so that
Wow.
was ingenuity back then. And I digress.
Amazing. Wonderful stuff. Clayton Cunningham, is that a relation of Briggs Cunningham? Clayton Cunningham?
No, Clayton's was a Canadian gentleman. It was CCR, and so after the RX-7, he ran the factory Nissan ZX program with Steve Millen and Johnny O'Connell.
Oh yes, we saw. We sold one of those cars too, the big ultra wide body 300ZX, right?
Yeah, and true to form, I mean those things they had huge power, but they were heavy. Yep. They ended up running water cooled brake calipers on that car. They developed water cooled brake calipers at one point. Those things were Adam Carolla, I think, has one of those.
I think that's right. I know you said you wanted to run open wheel cars, and I'm happy to talk about open wheel cars. But part of the reason I love sports car racing and always have is because of all these innovations you're talking about. There's such a wide variety of technology and fixes and innovation. And at least for people like me who are slow and only drive street cars for the most part, it relates a little bit more to kind of, some of the interesting technology you might find in street cars. So I could listen to you talk about these stories all day. Water cooled brake calipers is a new one on me though.
Yeah. I mean, we had a low-tech version in Trans Am. They used to run water cooled, but they'd put, sprayers into the ducts, like for the low-speed street courses that didn't have enough airflow. Roush and Protofab did that. They'd put a little sprayer, you run a water tank, and you'd have a mist to extra cool the brakes. But a water-cooled brake caliper is pretty legit. I mean, you think about totally. The engineering to have that in the front brakes with, everything turning the way it does and so forth.
If you don't mind, I said I wanted to talk Berettas for a little bit. You, I believe, own now a car that we listed on Bring a Trailer a while ago, Chevy Beretta race car. In fact, maybe we've listed even two of them. I can't remember, but it was a car that you drove in period and then that you won on the site. Isn't that correct? I loved that car, by the way. And that seller had a bunch of awesome cars on the site.
Yeah. That was a wild story. I actually own 3 Berettas now. I own 2 of them, both chassis that I drove that year. That was a GTU car.
Yeah.
And then the Trans Am Beretta also, I which I drove in 1990. I own one of those as well. But the one you're talking about was a wild story. And it's kind of weaves in a bunch of issues with auctions and cars. It's hard to know what it is.
Yeah. And this is the number 1 car, right? Big number 1 on the door and one that you drove in period. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Tried to sell it before and it was painted like an ICI, the Trans Am car. And the reason was, so to go back, I remember, so I had one of those cars and then the guy who owned the team had the other car. And so this car shows up and it's on Facebook. Someone says, hey, this guy just bought your championship car. And I'm like, no, it's not. And I could tell instantly the body wasn't right. And so I knew what it was. It was a show car, so forth. So he ends up buying this car. And I kept hearing from people, so-and-so has your car. I said, yeah, he actually doesn't. And so he finally calls me, Tommy Thompson. And he says, I hear a lot of different stuff about this car. I said, you want the good news or the bad news? He said, well, both. I said, the good news is I think it's a pretty cool car. The bad news is it isn't what you think it is. You think it's a Trans Am championship car and it's not. He said, well, GM sold it to me saying, I said, well, GM didn't know.
Oof, and that's tough.
So there was a lawsuit over that, I believe. He bought it at, it was during the bankruptcy and they were sending cars to Barrett Jackson and some of these places. He bought the car,
and they kind of didn't know what they had, or what's the story there? They unclear, sitting in some back storeroom or something like that.
Yeah, basically, when we won the championship that year, the next year when we moved to Trans Am, they needed show cars, so they rebodied them, which was stupid. They could have just painted them. They rebodied them, so that's why I could tell immediately the body wasn't right. And so I knew I'd follow those cars, so I'm pretty sure what it was. And then the next year they painted it the yellow, blue, and white, and so it's sitting in one of their warehouses or museums, and it's probably got a board in front of it saying championship car ICI. Yep. So they didn't know. The guy that cleaned out the warehouse is just going off the sign. And so he went back to him and said, this isn't what you, they gave him all of his money back and let him keep the car to avoid a lawsuit.
Wow.
So then he tried to sell it that way and it didn't go anywhere. And then I told him, I said, you need to put it back to how it was in GTU. And he went most of the way. He painted it the right way, and he put the clear spoiler on the back, but he
I
didn't
love
change.
that spoiler. That spoiler is so awesome
Yes,
on the back.
he didn't change the body, partially because they don't exist. I have the only existing body for that car and the mold. So eventually, I haven't even put it back yet. So at some point, that's a future project to get that car perfect, period, correct for the GTU car. And so what I told him to look for, I said, does it have a carbon fiber tunnel and a transaxle? And he says, yes. I said, okay. Well, the good news is it's not the 89 car, which was a total shitbox. It's the 88 GTU car that won a championship.
Yeah.
And that's what it was. Yeah.
So awesome that you're going to take it back. And then the idea would be, would you ever take that thing out and vintage race it?
I would. Yeah.
Okay.
Again, I have two of those, and that one for 50 grand, it was just like, I couldn't resist. I said, I've already got one, but I said to have both cars I drove that season would be pretty darn cool. And there's even an iteration of that car. The car he had actually had a 4.5 liter in it with Skull Bandit bodywork, and it ran one race at the Miami Grand Prix. And so I could put one back in Skull colors, which is just kind of a cool paint job.
Super awesome. Yeah.
And everyone likes the 4.5 liter stuff in the vintage races better than the GTU cars, which are just not as desirable, the 3 liter stuff. So I would probably do one of each.
Which one did you like driving better? The 4.5 liter is normally aspirated, right? And then a turbo on the smaller one. Is that right?
No, they're both normally aspirated. That's the thing. Okay. GTU was the small bore cars. So that's where you had the RX-7s and the ZXs and the smaller 911 stuff. And the big bore stuff was turbocharged 934s, Quattros, Cougars, Mustangs, the big bore stuff.
Yeah,
and so I liked them both. The GTU car is special to me. That was my first factory program. After I'd won in the Mazda, I got hired by Herb Fischel, and it was the first official factory Chevy program. Everything before that for 20 years was unofficial backdoor factory.
Right.
Everyone knew it was factory, but even in NASCAR, they weren't allowed to admit that they were racing. And so Herb convinced the powers to be, it's time to do some, there was a Beretta GT2 production car that Cars and Concepts, who owned the team. And so it was all put together. It was the first sort of integrated production race car program that Chevy did.
Yeah.
They hired me. It was my first factory program. And it kind of really, even though I'd won the GTU titles for Mazda, it was kind of what put me into the bigger leagues, if you will.
Sure. And when are you buying your Beretta street car? Is that going to be your fourth Beretta? You're getting one of those too?
It's funny you say that, because there are, I don't have to tell you, there are people that live and breathe those things.
Absolutely, there are. Yeah.
I saw one, and it brought damn good money. It was almost too nice a car. And I'm like, I said, that's the one to have, but I wasn't planning on spending that kind of money.
Yeah, no, maybe you don't need 4 Berettas. But yeah, they used to be kind of, the street cars used to be kind of the butt of the joke, but now people, in this Radwood era, people love those cars.
Yeah.
So,
and the GTU had the special wheels, a little bit different paint on it, and so forth. And that's what's so weird about the Trans Am car in silhouette cars. To have a Beretta, and then Bob Riley did that car. So it was kind of the second generation Riley Trans Am car. And I see pictures of that thing now, and I'm like, that thing looks like a funny car. I sat almost in the middle of the car.
Totally.
And we had ourselves totally convinced, because we had to argue it to the rules people all the time. This is totally, the silhouette's exactly the same as a Beretta. And we believed it, and now I look at it, I'm like, wow, that thing was stretched every which way. And it was
they're all swoopy and sexy. They look great. Man,
true
that's
story.
Hilarious. When was the first time you drove a stock car, Tommy?
It was pretty early on. It was Riverside, 1987. So I was 20 years old, and I'd only won, I guess I'd won one GTU championship, and a guy had worked with my dad on some stuff, was hooked up with this guy named Wayne Spears, who had one of the bigger West Coast teams. They ran Southwest Tour, and they'd always run a Winston West car in at Riverside, like the West Coast guys did, Herschel McGriff and all those guys. So their driver didn't like road courses, and he was so used to the little tiny short tracks, he didn't like the high speed of Riverside, and he just didn't want to do it. And so one of the crew guys had worked for my dad and had met me. He said, he gave me a call and said, "Are you willing to try this?" I said, 100%. And so I went out to Willow Springs to test the car, and it's a funny story. I got in it, I went out, and just on my out lap, I almost went off the track because the thing would stop.
Oh, man.
So I come in, and I'm like, something wrong with the brakes. And so they went through them all, and I went out again, same thing. I said, something's still wrong. And pretty soon, now there were a few more cars out. And I'm like, I think this is all they have.
This is just what the brakes are like.
They're 3,500 pounds, skinny tires, and not much in the way of brakes. And so I'm like, oh my God. But once you got over that, it was so fun because like when I went to Riverside, I made the show. I qualified West Coast team, and then the next year they had a better car. I qualified first day, led a lap because we didn't stop on one of the yellows. But the crazy thing is, even if you're in 30th place, you're in a fight with 5 other cars.
Amazing.
They're all the same. And so it was really hard racing. And then, so I drove for the West Coast cars, and then I got then when I was with the factory Chevy, then they put a program together in a great car. I drove a Hendrick R&D car at Watkins Glen in 19. That was only a couple years later. So that was 89. Yeah. 89, I drove a Hendrick R&D car, led late in that race, and then did a 5-race deal the next year that Dale Earnhardt Sr. oversaw for me, and kind of fairy tale stuff. But the Hendrick R&D car, it's funny. The minute you run well in a NASCAR race, everywhere else they want to know how much money you had. If you run up front in a cup race, your phone starts ringing. Back then especially, and just the number of eyeballs. After I led at the Glen in that car, I'm in Road Atlanta for the Trans Am race the next week. The race ends. It's Monday morning. I'm about to go to the airport. There's a knock on my Holiday Inn door, just angry knock. I open it. It's the police. I'm like, uh-oh. They're like, you got to move your truck. I said, I don't have a truck. And they're like, yeah, you do. I said, I'm telling you, I don't have a truck. They're like, yeah, you do. It's got your name on it. I'm like, oh, the race truck. Yeah. So it was the team hauler was blocking something. And it said my name on it. They went to the front desk. And so I said, that's, and the guy goes, wait a second. Are you the guy that led at Watkins Glen last week? I said, yeah. He goes, don't worry about it. We'll tell him to cool it. So here's a cop in Georgia that had seen me lead 3 laps at Watkins Glen. And I got more notoriety from those 3 laps than I guess it was 3 or 4 championships up until that point.
Amazing. And awesome that you got to run Riverside too. That's towards the end of Riverside's existence, isn't it? Is that the only time you raced there was in those cup cars?
No, my early Russell races were there. Oh, okay. I did go-kart races there, but I did the last 2 cup races, 87 and 88 were the very last NASCAR races there. And I think the cup race was the last pro race of any kind there in June of 88. Yeah.
That's one of those tracks that I'm so sorry I missed, Tommy. I always wanted, my dad went there when he was a kid in SoCal, but I never got to see it.
Oh, it was legendary. It was as good as you think it was. It really was.
Yeah. Watch those. Every once in a while, you see those videos of Petty and, 70s NASCARs, just absolutely sliding, cooking, going through the dirt, and people are standing right next to the track. Man, awesome.
There's one I just saw the other day of Dale Sr. They come up on lap traffic. He's dicing with Bodine, and Bodine lifts through the S's, and Earnhardt just heads to the dirt, keeps it nailed. Comes back on the track in front of both of them. It was awesome.
Awesome. I know you were kind of a road course ringer, but did you ever run ovals or super speedways or anything, or did you only run road courses in cup cars?
I ran 2 ovals in NASCAR. I ran one Xfinity race at New Hampshire, and I ran the 500 lapper at Rockingham in the cup car. And that was part of that 5-race deal that Dale Sr. oversaw. So other than that, I also was invited for, I guess, 6 years of IROC. So those were all ovals. They didn't even have a single road course the years I was doing it. So other than those 2 races, IROC was my only oval experience.
Gotcha. And yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down. Sometimes people are converts. Sometimes they're like, no, thank you.
I mean, I wish I did more of it. I should have won a couple of IROC races, should have and could have. I was super, super close and made a couple tiny mistakes, and it cost me. So I never got to win one. But I mean, I have way more appreciation for it. A lot of people say it's stupid. I mean, it's so nuanced. I like road racing better, but the oval stuff is really cool. And it's
and once you dip your toe in, you're like, oh, I want to master this too, right? It's its own thing.
Yes. And it's, like I said, the nuance and the subtlety is the other thing is the stock cars, they're unlike anything else. A stock car on an oval, I told guys like Dario and Paul Tracy and those guys when they were going over there, because if you're a road racer, every car you've ever driven, if you're fast in this, you're going to be fast in that and fast in that. You just got to figure them out a little bit because 99% transfers from one to the other. And so the question is, how hard can it be? Everybody says. And I said, that's the wrong question. You need to be asking yourself, how different can it be? because it is so different and you're just lost at times. You'll spin out on a short track and you'll have no idea why.
Yeah.
Every time you spun out after the beginning of your career, you knew why you spun out on a road race. So there's just a bunch of stuff that you just have to figure out that's just different. And that's why, especially then, before engineering became such a big part of it, the big difference, what Dale Sr. and Rusty and all the guys that were good, they were half great driver and they were half crew chief. Now you don't need to be a crew chief anymore. The engineers handled it. But back in that era, you needed to understand the cars to keep up with the tire wear and the track, or you were just lost.
Yeah. I grew up loving sports car racing and road racing. And my buddies who like dirt track racing and have really converted me. I went to the Indy 500 this year and went and saw the little 500, saw a 500 lapper at a little quarter mile oval where they have to do tire changes on sprint cars. And I mean, it's unbelievable. It's totally different, but it's just as impressive once you really learn to appreciate it.
Little 500, was that at Anderson?
Yeah. Have you ever been?
I have. And my crew chief, Dan Binks, is now the Mission Foods car that was on the pole. And yes.
Absolutely. He was flying.
Yes.
Oh man.
Yep.
That I have to tell you, Tommy, it's one of the best motorsports things I've ever seen. It's unbelievable. It's not like anything else I've ever experienced. Now I think it was better than the 500, the Indy 500, to be totally honest. Not that the Indy 500 wasn't awesome. It was, but the little 500 was kind of eye-opening. I mean, it was mind-blowing.
Yeah. Well, I have not been yet to the Chili Bowl, which is coming up.
That's the one I want to do. Yeah, that's the one indoors.
Everything I've heard is it's a religious event. So
that's what all my circle track buddies say.
The carbon monoxide in the building is for real. It's an actual issue, So my crew chief is actually working on a solution. People have oxygen, but he's actually he's tested his cars and he's tuned them with catalytics, and he can, and he's trying to get inertia. No one wants to mess stuff up, and they're afraid to open the door. But eventually, he says it cuts the emissions by to 1/10, and the power is virtually the same if you do it right. So hopefully that'll get fixed here soon.
Well, I really want to go to that one very badly. My buddies are always like, you think the building's big, and then you pan out, and the pits are actually inside the building too. It's so freaking big, unbelievable. Well, gosh, Tommy, I could talk to you all day long. I'd be remiss if we didn't at least briefly talk about your pivot into the limelight, your time as a commentator on television. You're so personable. I can see why it happened. But how did that come about? How did you make that pivot?
Well, it was funny because my racing career was a study in leaving no stone unturned and trying to control as many pieces many variables and pieces as you could. My TV career was exactly the opposite, where I've done almost nothing to pursue it. And so it started with my PR girl's fiance was a producer, or actually he wasn't even a producer. He was a director for the IndyCar coverage. And when I had my Trans Am win streak in 97, I started getting a lot of national attention for the streak. And he had met me and he thought I would be good on camera. And he kept pitching me, unbeknownst to me, to the IndyCar brass, or the ABC brass, I guess. And they said, nah. And then World Cup came and he became the producer for 2 races and says, I want to bring Kendall in as a third announcer and have him remote. And they're like, no. He's like, well, am I the producer or not? And they're like, you are. He says, okay. So he brought me in, and that's how it started. And it's funny. It was Elkhart Lake, and I won't get into the whole story about the serious bender at Siebken's the night before, but I kind of had a sense that people were ready for a little less stiff, a little less. And now it's hard to remember how by the book and low risk things were then, because I went just a little bit outside the window and everyone's like, oh my God, I can't believe you said that. And I'm like, but I sensed that people were starving for that.
Sure.
And so when I did more of it, I was actually hungover doing that one. But I honestly didn't care that much. But the next year I did 5 races, I think. And I remember talking to myself and I said, I kind of like this. So I said, how do I still act like I don't care? Because that was the secret.
Yeah.
And so my little mantra was, before every show, I'd say, try to get yourself fired a little bit today. And so, as a way because you can always piss someone off, and the owners have so much power and so forth that you hurt the feelings. But I said, I can't think about that. I have to call it the way I see it. And someone asked me later, how do you do that? I said, I know that Roger Penske and Carl Haas and Chip Ganassi can get me fired. I said, there's this perverse sort of, job security. even though I'm not getting paid by the fan, I'm actually working for the fan. And so if they
Totally.
want to fire their fans, they can do that.
That resonates so much with me, Tommy. People are hungry for authenticity, right? Like it's actually a thing that fuels Bring a Trailer and has for years, right? I was a fan of this company for many years before I worked here. I just applied to every job till they were dumb enough to hire me. And it's been the same kind of thing that's guided me and I think has guided a lot of my colleagues, which is like, think about your audience and give them what they want, right? Like they're the people we're trying to please. Be authentic, be true. Don't bullshit people. Just be straight up, say what you think. Just say what it is. Don't fluff it up. Just be straightforward, be authentic. That's what people want. And it's almost all you need, right? That'll just take you the rest of the way.
It really is simple, but it gets disconnected because you are working for the customer, but your boss forgets that. If you've got the right boss, they don't forget that. But you can get fired. I can vouch for that. You can't. Sure, get fired.
You could be too authentic. I guess that's true. And you don't want to be mean spirited about it or anything. But people really do crave straightforward commentary. I know I sure do. Very quickly before we end, I'd just like to talk a little bit more about your BAT background because you won that Beretta GTU car, but you also, it's like a 70s. You mentioned boats, actual boats, but you also like big American boats too. What's the deal with that? You won it's a Cadillac Fleetwood, I think, about a 79 or a 78, something like that.
I think it's 76. Yes. That
and I've seen comments from you on other similar cars. So this is obviously an interest of yours.
Yeah, it goes kind of back to the country Squires, I guess. I have my beloved chicken car, which is on a 73 Olds 98 chassis.
Right.
That was, it was a case of, almost accidental purchase. I was looking on my phone. I was getting a breakfast burrito, and that thing was up, and I hadn't spent a ton of time looking at it. I'm like, that thing, it was like $7,000. I'm like, oh my God. So I threw a couple bids in, and next thing you know, I'm the owner. So I wasn't setting out to get that. I'd love to know what the percentage of people that buy cars on your site were actually looking for that car.
That's part of the magic, right? Somebody's like, I'm on the 18th hole and I need to stop to bid on my phone real quick. And I'm holding up the party behind me. No, we've heard those stories a lot of times for sure.
Well, actually, and now I think about another boat, and this one doesn't show up in my history because it was done with a friend, but less than a year ago, there was a cherry 1992 Lincoln Stretch, white, and it was absolutely cherry. It was privately owned and never rented. It's got a blue velour interior. It had 29,000 miles on it. And I'm in this car.
That's probably the only one left like that. All the other ones got used up, right?
Yeah, it's got the boomerang antenna.
Yeah.
The stuff inside, the motorized doors and the push-button booze dispensers. Everything was perfect. And so I'm in this car text group of guys called the Riff Raff Club. And one of the guys says, I'm going to buy this for the club. And I said, I'm in for half. And so he started bidding. Well, he didn't start bidding. So that was at the start of the auction, and I had it flagged. So the last day, I said, "Hey, Adrian, I was serious about it." He said, "Okay, yeah." He says, "I'll go to $15,000 on that." I said, "Okay, I'm in for half." And he ended up buying it for $18,000, and I was in for half. And I was trying to figure out how to tell my wife about it. And we set up an S corp. I said, "We're going to do like mob wives and prom redo deals, like high-end rentals for this."
Totally.
And then I went to an F1 race viewing with the group, and he says, he's an Argentinian guy. He says, "I really love that car." He says, "Would it break your heart if I keep it all myself?" And he says, "You can use it whenever you want." I said, "That's even better."
Yeah.
And so anyway, so that's a third car I have a piece of. It's also a big American barge.
That's amazing. That's a great one. And then literal barges or boats. I saw you commenting on some kind of a speedboat. You mentioned, you were kind of a boat guy growing up. I think one of your comments mentioned Sanger. I love Sangers, especially if they've got a metal flake on them, maybe with an outboard or. Okay, could tell.
Well, that was my dad's first boat, and he didn't have any dough. The gel coat was heavy gold flake, and it had a white stripe around the edge that flared at the back.
That's the one I want. I want gold flake. That's exactly it. Oh, man.
Gold flake, and it had a 406 Ford. It wasn't a Chevy. It wasn't a 420. But anyways, with a V drive, and that was our family ski boat for a good while until he, again, started making some more dough. And you'd sit in the back seat, you'd burn your legs against the pipes trying to
Yeah.
get the ski rope out. And
Yeah.
the one time my mom, because we weren't old enough to drive the boat yet, my mom drove when my dad skied. She hit the fuel pump thing with her knee and it died, and couldn't figure. So it was just, and then towing it behind the country Squire, overheating, putting Coors beer in the radiator in the middle of the desert. So, anyways.
Oh man, I want that whole setup. Where were you going? Were you Lake Mead? Did you go to Elsinore when you were local?
No,
What were
that
your
was
lakes?
Colorado River.
Colorado River.
River is where we used to go.
Havasu. Did you ever hit Havasu? Go into the.
We went to, this was way before Havasu was Havasu, but yes, we went to Havasu once or twice. The group we went with seemed to like the river better. And we had a
Yeah.
couple,
Okay.
they rent these little, there was an A-frame and we'd rent that. And that was our spot.
Man, I wish I had your whole setup. That Sanger behind a country Squire, that's like the dream setup with maybe one of those vintage green Coleman coolers full of Miller High Life. Come on.
Well, it's funny because then our upgraded setup was a custom van with a 20-foot Spectra was the next
Heck yes.
deal. So at some point, if I ever get over the hump and have FU money, I'm going to just have that just cuz.
Oh man. Well, Tommy, I don't know if there's a better place to end than that. I wish you all the luck. That's my dream setup too. Really appreciate you doing this. Before we break away, any parting shots? Anything you want to leave folks with before we end?
Well, I was thinking about the magic of Bring a Trailer and, the LA Times Classifieds. And I posted something on my Instagram that someone else had posted about going through Auto Trader and circling the cars you wanted your dad to buy. And I posted that. I got more response from that post than anything else. That's me. Guys, girls, all loved it. And so it's tapped into what you guys obviously know you've tapped into, this sort of almost universal amongst car people. And some of them aren't even the heaviest car people, but they've got great car memories, and it's part of their life story, and they want to recreate that. So, and I learn a ton in the comments. Everybody thinks I know everything about all these cars. I don't. So, the Porsche guys are crazy, but I learn a lot from them, and I think it's awesome.
You've got a comment of the day. I noticed it's got like 50 thumbs up or something, and it was on the Acura, the open cockpit Acura LMP car that we listed. Unfortunately, didn't sell, although it got a strong bid. I think last year or something like that. And it's a hugely popular comment. I don't know if you noticed that. I can't even remember exactly what you said, but people were excited to see you weighing in.
Well, I don't remember that, and I don't know. Maybe I'm not set up that I'm notified that you're getting the thumbs up, whatever. Probably better that way because I don't need to know that. But I didn't know that it had resonated like that.
It was, honey, I think I'm starting to grow up. I sold all my fancy cars and I'm buying a used Acura. It's a pretty good comment. You're actually you're a pretty good peanut gallery member, Tommy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Little shit posting, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's part of the magic of BAT. Well, hey, man, I really appreciate you doing this. I know the community is going to love hearing all these stories. We could go on and on and on. I would actually love to do a part 2 sometime. I feel like we barely scratched the surface. There's so many wonderful stories in your career. But thank you so much for doing this. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening. As always, please don't hesitate to reach out with questions, concerns, suggestions to podcast@bringatrailer.com. Thanks again, and we will catch you next time.